All right, folks, I'm Kelly Hill, contributing editor with RCRTech. Looking forward to this session on validating secure and resilient O-RAN networks with real-world test and measurement. I'm happy to welcome Owen O'Donnell, Terra VM Marketing Manager with VIAVI Solutions, and Paul McKibbin, who is Senior Product Manager for SNE Ignite with Calnex Solutions. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks,
Hi.
Kelly.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and just jump right in. And we'll start with kind of the big picture. What has changed with Open RAN and why is this creating new challenges for customers?
Thank you. Yeah. So the disaggregation of ORAN means a move from single vendor systems to multi-vendor ecosystems. And whilst that does create a huge innovation potential, it also introduces real complexity because every component now has to interoperate irrespective of vendor, and it still has to meet those performance, timing, and security standards.
And so let's talk about how that complexity then shows up in sort of the real customer environments.
Yeah, in practice, interop is still a major pain point. ORAN ORUs are often only validated with a single ODU vendor and on specific software versions, which means that every new hardware and software combination becomes a new integration challenge. And often that can be a long and a manual process. And that's where VIAVI and Calnex's solutions fulfill the need for an ORAN standards validation ecosystem.
Okay. So piggybacking off of that, so even when systems connect successfully, does that mean the job's done? We're good to go?
And not at all, Kelly. In fact, customers consistently report that performance can degrade quickly when real-world conditions appear. So, a system that works in ideal conditions can fail under realistic network behavior.
So then let's talk about what's actually at stake for operators and vendors here, because it sounds like quite a bit.
Yeah, exactly. It's mainly about risk. So, vendors need proven interoperability to win operator trust, and then operators need predictable performance with low integration risk. And without these, deployments become slower, you're going to get more expense spent, and ultimately they'll be less reliable.
Okay. All right. So in that context, then let's talk a little bit about why pre-certification validation is becoming critical in this kind of environment.
Well, it's critical because failing at the certification stage is extremely costly in both time and money. Whereas pre-certification testing, this can ensure that systems are already aligned to standards before entering the official labs in the OTICs, etc. And then this can significantly reduce the risk of failure. So that's the reason that they would look to do pre-certification validation.
Okay. So then can we talk a little bit about what the difference is between basic testing and the kind of validation that we're talking about here today?
Yeah, no problem. It's a good point. So basic testing basically provides functionality. It says, does it do what it's supposed to do? But validation proves performance and resilience and interoperability under real world conditions across protocols, across signaling, timing, and security domains. So that would be the kind of big difference between the validation testing compared to, just the performance or functionality testing.
Okay. So you mentioned real world conditions, and I know that's always important when it comes to, to really making sure that systems function. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of real world conditions in testing?
Yeah, having real world conditions is critical because real networks aren't perfect. They have variability and delay, jitter, congestion. And if you don't replicate those conditions in the lab, you can't reliably predict how the system behaves when in production. And that introduces all of those areas of risk, which Owen was referring to.
Okay. So one of the things that we discussed in preparing for this session was negative testing. Can you talk about what that is and why it's important?
Yeah. Negative testing helps to find the limits of the system, is where performance starts to degrade, or even a worst case, the system ceases to function. So it's incredibly valuable because it shows, not just whether something works, but how far it can be pushed safely and still work. Delay, emulation, packet modification, and automation are just a few of the ways that SME Ignite enables that negative testing.
Okay. So let's jump over to industry standards, because that really forms the foundation for a lot of testing strategies. So how do industry standards shape this particular validation approach?
Yeah, foundation's a really good way to describe it because the lowest layer of the foundation is ORAN's Working Group 4, which focuses on interface correctness and timing between components. Then again, building on that foundation, OpenRAN's Working Group 5 focuses on interop. So now we've moved a layer and built upon that foundation. And then the Open RAN TIFG E2E looks at how the components function in an end-to-end. So you've built on, layer on layer of standards. And then finally, whenever you have that end-to-end system, the Working Group 11 Security Working Group, they validate the robustness of that interoperation from an end-to-end. And then together, those four standards, they ensure full confidence, full confidence in the system, not just compliance on paper.
Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the details of how all of this fits together. And I think there's one slide that we want to bring up so as we talk about some of the specific solutions, because I do want to ask, as we think about the kind of holistic picture that we're trying to build here, I want to ask where the VIAVI and Calnex solutions actually fit into, doing this kind of validation.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Kelly. So it brings together, complementary strengths. So VIAVI, we already have a wide-ranging portfolio, should I say, of ORAN test products, and that covers end-to-end validation. It covers UE simulation with our TM500 product. It's got core emulation on the right-hand side there with TerraVM. In the middle, you can see security testing with TerraVM Security Auditor. And now we're complementing those existing VIAVI solutions with Calnex. So Calnex provides highly precise network impairment and timing emulation across the front haul, mid haul, and back haul with its SME Ignite tool.
So what does that enable that maybe wasn't possible before?
Again, that's a great point. So this enables true end-to-end validation. So across the whole network, from core to radio, while introducing controlled impairments like delay, jitter, packet loss, and errors, so you can test under realistic and repeatable conditions. That's what the important point here is.
Okay. So you mentioned sort of that end-to-end. I want to ask just quickly about front haul in particular, because that's something that I think we hear over and over really needs to be solid. So let's talk maybe a little bit about why precision is important when it comes to testing front haul.
Yeah, front haul and the mid haul are extremely sensitive to delays, as low as 8 microseconds. So if the test tools introduce unpredictable latency, you can disrupt the ODU to ORU synchronization, or worst case, produce inaccurate results. So you don't know what the behavior is whenever you go to deployment. And that's why nanosecond accuracy, ultra low intrinsic latency, and maintenance of the sync plane, the S plane, are critical for network emulator.
Okay, interesting. All right, so I think one of the conversations that we're hearing over and over today is there's a lot about AI, obviously, but another part of that is really automation and how automation, improves efficiency, makes processes more intelligent. So I want to ask in this context, how automation improves the testing process that you folks are talking about.
Yeah, indeed. So, well, with automation platforms such as Vamos, you can kind of get repeatable test execution. You can get faster configuration. You can get automated pass-fail results. And then also, really importantly, you can get detailed reporting. And this combination of things kind of dramatically speeds up the validation cycle, but it also can reduce the human error, Kelly.
Always, always the big question mark there is reducing the human error.
Indeed.
Okay, but let's talk about the outputs because I think that kind of flows nicely from the point that you just made, Owen. So, what do customers actually get out of this testing? When we think about the outputs, what are customers getting out of it?
Yeah, completely agree. So, you're getting so much more than just a pass fail. It's not just a case of if a test passed or if it failed and that's the end, the end of the test. You're getting performance limits, where the throughput dropped, at what point did it drop at? You're getting interoperability validation across different vendors. You're getting KPI measurements, latency, throughput, quality of service. You're also getting failure thresholds under stress conditions. So you can throw a huge amount of traffic at something and see at what point are we starting to see the creaks. And then you're also getting security and robustness validation. So, you're getting a huge amount more than just a pass fail.
Okay, that sounds like a ton of really useful information. So I'm wondering, can you talk about how those figures, how those KPIs, how all of that information and those insights translate into real deployment decisions? Because I mean, it sounds like that's kind of the natural, flow of information is really getting what you need to have that real world insight for deployment.
Exactly. And and these measurements and results, they kind of transform directly into network design. So, things like fiber distance, latency budgets, architecture choices, these are all made easier by understanding the measurements. So, understanding latency limits, for example, that can help operators decide how far they can separate the ODU from the ORU, or in fact the baseband components in the 5G network without impacting performance. So that's how you kind of have real decisions made based on these testing that you can do in the lab.
Okay. All right. So one more question that I want to ask that just I think kind of maybe brings some of these different points together. And that's, so what do you see as the bottom line value here for customers? There's a lot of different insights. There's a lot of different information. The end-to-end, value proposition, how would you frame that for customers?
Yes, Kelly, it's really about de-risking deployment. This initiative proves interoperability, validates real-world performance, as we spoke earlier about real-world networks not being perfect, and ensures compliance to the O-RAN standards so that operators can deploy with confidence and begin that journey to getting the return on investment.
Okay. So then I'm going to kind of ask the opposite of that question, maybe back into it a little bit differently and say, what happens if customers skip this kind of level of validation? I mean, O-RAN, it is maturing. It's becoming something that is being more widely used. But there's still, I think, a lot of heavy lifting. So what happens if somebody skips that kind of the kind of validation that we're talking about here today?
Well, if that's the case, then they can risk poor performance in the live network. They can risk high operational costs, maybe delays to rollout, ultimately impacting, revenue generation, customer experience, and most importantly, their reputation. So quite a lot at risk there, Kelly, by skipping or skimping on some of these testings.
Okay. So then I think maybe I'll ask each of you if you can kind of summarize 2 or 3 things that you hope people take away from this particular session today. As we think about all of the points that you've made about, the importance of pre-certification validation, really having the insights and the KPIs and getting the real world data that ensure that you're de-risking a process that still has quite a bit of risk. Paul, maybe we can start with you in terms of, what are your key takeaways from today?
Yeah, we find that the O-RAN standards are an essential foundation was the word that you used earlier, and that's correct. It's the foundation in order to ensure this interoperability, and so that's fundamental. And I think that the joint solution from VIAVI and Calnex allows those standards to be validated against. And it's also it's a set of pre-integrated components, so it's not something that the operator has to assemble themselves.
Okay. Owen, your thoughts on what people should take away from this?
Yeah, so I mean, to me, it's about understanding that real networks. I mean, we're all subscribers. We're all out there daily using our phones for everything from streaming to FaceTime to downloading files. And networks aren't pure. They're not exact. There's always going to be interference. There's going to be fading. There's going to be contention. And trying to get that understood in the lab is so important. If you can understand what the limits of the network are with those impairments, and we can do that now. That's what's been missing for some time. And the combination of the VIAVI emulation and testing tools with the Calnex impairment generation brings that together beautifully in the lab. So you don't even have to, go out and hope for kind of degradation. You can actually perform that in the lab with emulated degradation. And that's that would be my big takeaway from today.
Okay. So I'm wondering if either one of you can give us maybe a little bit more insight on how you see your customers making use of these tools, because I think that's one of the things that, when it comes to deployments and when it comes to, the value that people see in these kind of tools, there are still complications with ORAN. And if either one of you can offer maybe some insights on, the pain points that you see your customers dealing with that, these solutions are helping them solve.
I think I would say, Kelly, that we've kind of got two types of customer here. One is the vendor. And the vendor needs to ensure that what they're producing is according to the standards. They have to kind of understand the standards and then implement their product based on that. But also they could misinterpret the standards, and that's something that can easily be done. And by at least testing against these working group standards and the ORAN Alliance and the 3GPP standards, you can then see if the product does what it's supposed to do. But the operator is the second customer, and they, very often they're going to have a mix of equipment, especially in an ORAN environment. You're going to have different ORU vendors, ODU, maybe OCU vendors. You can have RIC. You could have a different core network. And then when you pull that unique mix together, then that needs its own dedicated testing environment as well. And it's very possible and probable that their unique mix will not have been tested by the vendor, because they can only do maybe one DU against the different ORU, whereas the vendor itself or the operator itself is going to have a very unique mix that needs to have that that done in their own lab. So from my point of view, we're seeing two different customers with two different testing ambitions, but all equally important. As Paul, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, we do see customers today, network equipment manufacturers who are testing with 4 or 5 different ORUs to ensure they have compliance. And it's about the disaggregation of ORAN, where it's designed to eliminate that single vendor lock-in.
I think that's a really interesting point. That's the potential combinations there alone is, a pretty heavy lift, just interoperability, as well as functionality and really performance. Wow, that's the kind of thing that seems like if you can do it in the lab, that gets you a lot closer to deployment, and hopefully a smooth transition there. All right. Well, any final
Yeah,
thoughts?
hopefully a risk-free deployment. Yeah.
Well, I think that's kind of what I'm gathering from the conversations that we've had today is, when you're looking at that kind of a multi-vendor environment, yes, I think that's what operators are looking for, but there are still quite a few risks, and testing is one of the ways that you de-risk those deployments. So, all right.
Agreed.
Yeah. Okay. Any final thoughts from either one of you?
Not from me, Kelly, but thank you very much. Always a pleasure chatting to you, and always happy to share our thoughts from a testing point of view with you and the wider audience. So thank you very much.
All right. Well, folks, thank you so much. It was really fantastic to get your insights here today. And to our audience, thank you for your attention, and we will move on to the next session.